The cold in the church was a different kind of cold than the one that lived on the prairie. Out there, the cold was an honest adversary, a clean, sharp thing that announced its presence with a roar of wind and a bite of ice. In here, it was a damp, creeping chill that seeped from the stone walls and settled in the bones, a cold that smelled of old hymns and unspoken judgments. It was the cold of a place where grace was preached but rarely practiced. He stood at the back, a solid shape of worn leather and wool, feeling as out of place as a wolf in a sheep pen. He had only come to town for salt and wire, but the bell had been ringing, and a morbid curiosity, an old instinct to watch the follies of men, had drawn him inside. He saw her immediately. She stood at the altar, a small, still figure swallowed by a white dress that was too fine for the drab little church, too delicate for the raw-boned country. It was a dress meant for a warmer place, for a life of soft hands and gentle sunlight, not the hard-scrabble existence this valley offered. Her skin was the color of old ivory, and her dark hair was intricately pinned in a style no woman in the territory wore. She was a foreigner, a piece of fragile porcelain set down in a world of hammered iron. Her stillness was the most profound thing about her. It was not the calm of a happy bride, but the frozen quiet of a trapped animal listening for the snap of a twig. The man beside her, the groom, was a peacock of a man, fleshy and florid in a suit that was too tight across the shoulders. He was the son of the town's most prosperous merchant, a man whose wealth was as loud and ill-fitting as his suit. The groom shifted his weight from foot to foot, his gaze darting not to his bride, but to a formidable woman in the front pew, his mother, a monolith of black bombazine and disapproval. The silence in the church stretched, growing thin and brittle. The preacher cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound that did nothing to fill the void. Then the groom spoke, and his voice was a wet, ugly sound that slid into the sacred quiet. "I can't do this." A collective gasp, a ripple of satisfaction through the pews. This was the drama they had come for. The rancher at the back felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before. It was a weed that grew best in the cultivated soil of small towns. The woman at the altar did not move, not a flicker of an eyelash. Her gaze remained fixed on the stained glass window behind the preacher, a crude depiction of a lamb that looked more like a frightened goat. The groom, emboldened by the town's rapt attention and a sharp nod from his mother, turned to her. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice rising, performing now for the audience. "A business arrangement. My father thought your family's shipping connections would be an asset, but we found a better partner. A local partner." He spat the word local as if it were a shield. "There's no place for your kind here. It wouldn't be right." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, bright light flooding the altar. It stripped her bare, leaving her exposed not just as a jilted bride, but as a piece of foreign merchandise being returned for a refund. The rancher watched her hands, the only part of her that betrayed the truth. They were clenched at her sides, knuckles white, holding on to the last fragments of her dignity. She had nothing. No family here, no money, no home. She was a ghost before she had even had a chance to become a person. The silence that followed the groom's pronouncement was worse than the words themselves. It was a silence of agreement, of confirmation. The town had passed its verdict. Into that void, a new sound emerged. The slow, deliberate tread of heavy boots on the stone floor. Every head turned. The rancher walked down the central aisle, his steps measured and unhurried. He did not look at the gawking faces in the pews. He did not look at the sputtering groom or his triumphant mother. He stopped a few feet from the altar, his eyes on the woman. He saw the faint tremor in her chin, the only crack in her composure. His own past rose up to meet him, a ghost of a different sort, the memory of another woman, pale and still, and the crushing silence of a home emptied by fever. He had lived with that emptiness for 5 years. It had hollowed him out, leaving a space so vast and quiet that sometimes he thought he would be consumed by it. He looked at this woman, this stranger, and saw a different kind of emptiness, the utter void of a future that had just been stolen from her. He spoke, and his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a sound meant for the open air, not the close confines of a church. "The lady needs a name." He did not phrase it as a question. It was a statement of fact. The preacher blinked, bewildered. The groom's mother rose slightly from her pew, her face a mask of outrage. The rancher's gaze did not waver from the woman. I have a name, he continued. The words simple, solid things. And a roof. It's a sound roof. He offered the facts of his life as if they were tools he was laying on a workbench. A name, a roof. Practical. Sturdy. He was not offering romance, or passion, or any of the things promised in the songs and stories. He was offering survival. He was offering a bulwark against the coming storm of her destitution. For the first time, she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, fathomless, and for a moment, he saw the full depth of her despair. Then, something else flickered within them, a spark of fierce, defiant pride. She turned her head and looked at the man who had just discarded her. She looked at his mother, whose face was contorted with smug victory. She looked out at the rows of hungry eyes. Then she looked back at the stranger, this solid, weathered man who smelled of pine and cold air. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was an acceptance born of sheer absence of any other option, but it was also a choice. In that moment, she chose the unknown devil over the one who had just shown his face. The rancher nodded back, a gesture of grim finality. He turned to the stunned preacher. Finish it. The journey to his homestead was made in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape itself. The wagon wheels cut through the thin layer of snow on the road, the sound muffled and rhythmic. The town and its suffocating judgment fell away behind them, replaced by a wide, empty sky the color of slate. He had placed her on the wagon seat beside him and thrown a rough wool blanket over her shoulders. The fine white dress looked absurd and tragic against the coarse brown fabric. He did not speak, his attention fixed on the horses and the road ahead. His profile was stark, a thing carved from granite and grief. She felt the cold sink deep into her, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the cold of absolute uncertainty. She had traded one cage for another, and she did not know the nature of this new jailer. She watched his hands on the reins, large, calloused, competent. They were the hands of a man who did his own work, who wrestled a living from the unforgiving land. There was no softness in them, but there was a steadiness that was, in its own way, a comfort. She was a piece of flotsam, and she had just lashed herself to a rock. Whether the rock would save her or smash her to pieces remained to be seen. The homestead appeared as the light began to fail, not so much a beacon as a concession to the wilderness. It was a simple cabin of dark, weathered logs, a solid barn, and a tracery of fences that seemed to hold the vast emptiness at bay. There were no flowers, no softened edges, no sign of anything but grim, relentless function. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. A deep, profound emptiness radiated from the place, a silence that was older and deeper than the one in the church. It was the silence of loss. Inside, a fire was laid in the stone hearth, waiting for a match. The cabin consisted of a single room, brutally clean and spare. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, a ladder leading to a sleeping loft. He lit the fire and a lantern, and the small space filled with a flickering, golden light that did little to warm the palpable chill of loneliness that clung to the walls. He moved with an economy of motion, preparing a meal without a single wasted step. He sliced bacon into an iron skillet, added onions and potatoes, and soon the cabin was filled with the honest smell of frying food. He set 2 plates on the table, 2 tin cups. He did not ask if she was hungry. He simply assumed it as a fact of her existence. She ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger that shamed her. Each bite was a victory against the void that had opened up at her feet. He ate slowly, his gaze distant, watching the fire. He was not studying her, not in a predatory or even curious way. It was the detached observation of a man assessing a new reality, a new variable that had been introduced into his rigidly controlled equation of solitude. The meal was a transaction, a fueling. The gulf between them was as wide as the table. When they were finished, he rose and gestured to the ladder. "The loft is yours," he said. The words were not unkind, but they were a clear demarcation. A boundary. Up there is your space. Down here is mine. He was not her husband. He was her proprietor. She was a necessity he had acquired, like a new axe or a sack of flour. She climbed the ladder without a word, her ridiculous dress catching on the rough-hewn rungs. The loft was small, containing only a straw-stuffed mattress and a pile of thick blankets. From here, she could see the entire room below. She watched him clean their plates, his movements methodical and precise. He banked the fire for the night, blew out the lantern, and lay down on his own bed, fully clothed except for his boots. Sleep did not come. She lay in the unfamiliar darkness, listening to the sound of a stranger's breathing, the sigh of the wind against the roof, and the deep, resonant silence of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The kindness he had shown her felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, a thing she did not understand and could not trust. The next days fell into a rhythm of silence. The rancher was a restless man, always working, as if constant motion was the only thing that kept his ghosts at bay. He rose before dawn, and the smell of coffee would drift up to the loft, a signal that the day had begun. He moved through his chores with a relentless efficiency that was both admirable and intimidating. He mended harnesses, chopped wood, tended to his small herd of cattle, his movements always deliberate, never hurried. He spoke only when necessary, his words as sparse and functional as everything else in his life. The bucket is for water, the wood box needs filling, there's stew on the stove. She watched him, learning the silent language of his world. She learned that the slight tightening of his jaw meant a storm was coming, that the way he ran a hand over a horse's flank was the closest he came to tenderness. In the beginning, she stayed inside the cabin, a prisoner of her own uncertainty. She cleaned what was already clean, swept floors that held no dust. She was a ghost in his house, and the silence between them grew heavy, freighted with all the things they did not say. A week after her arrival, a snowstorm descended, a white fury that imprisoned them in the cabin for 2 days. The wind howled like a hungry beast, and the world shrank to the 4 walls of the small room. The confinement was a crucible. The silence became unbearable, a living presence in the room. She could feel his restlessness coiling in the small space. He paced, checked the door, stared out the single window at the swirling white chaos. On the second day, she could stand it no longer. He was cleaning a rifle at the table, his movements precise and hypnotic. She came down the ladder and stood before him. "I will not be a charity," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. He looked up, his eyes a pale, startling gray. He did not seem surprised. He simply waited. "I must work," she said. "I will earn my keep." It was a statement, not a plea. It was the first piece of herself she had reclaimed. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her slight frame, her soft hands. He saw the iron will in her eyes, the same defiant spark he had seen in the church. He gave a slow nod. "The storm will break tomorrow. There will be work." When the world emerged from the whiteout, it was pristine and blindingly bright. The work was brutal. Fences had drifted over, and the cattle needed to be found and driven to the shelter of the barn. He expected her to stay in the cabin, but she was there when he went to the barn, wrapped in an old coat of his that swallowed her whole, her face determined. He handed her a shovel without comment, and they worked side by side, digging out the path to the barn. The labor was punishing. The cold was a physical blow, and the snow was heavy and wet. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, and he expected her to fall behind, to give up. She did not. Her movements were clumsy at first, but she was a quick learner. She matched his pace, her breaths coming in ragged, white plumes. When her shovel struck a hidden rock and the handle jarred her, sending a shock up her arms, she stumbled but did not cry out. She simply took a new grip and plunged the shovel back into the snow. He found himself watching her. He saw not fragility, but a resilience that was as hard and unyielding as the winter landscape. She was not made of porcelain after all. She was made of wire and whipcord. By the end of the day, they had cleared the path and secured the cattle. They returned to the cabin in the gathering dusk, exhausted and silent. As she was climbing the ladder to the loft, her body aching with an unfamiliar fatigue, she saw him run a hand over a small, carved wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece. It was a simple, unfinished thing, but the gesture was one of such profound, unconscious tenderness that it stopped her breath. It was a motion of memory, of a love that still lived in his hands. In that moment, she understood that his emptiness was not a void, but a space carved out by a great and terrible loss. The fragile peace of their silent routine was shattered 2 weeks later, on their first trip back into town for supplies. The town had not forgotten. It had been waiting, nursing its judgment, eager for the next act of the drama. As they stepped into the general store, a hush fell. Eyes followed them, sharp and hungry. And then she appeared, as if summoned by the collective will of the town's malice. The groom's mother, draped in black silk, sailed toward them, a brittle smile fixed on her face. Well, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The happy couple. I must say, ranching life seems to agree with you. Her eyes raked over the woman's simple, worn dress, a stark contrast to the white silk she had worn at the altar. The rancher placed the sack of flour he was holding onto the counter, a quiet, deliberate thud that cut through the woman's poisonous tone. He did not look at her. He looked at the storekeeper. We need coffee. And salt. The mother-in-law would not be deterred. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss that was meant to be overheard by the entire store. I do hope you're being taken care of, my dear, she said to the woman. It must be so. Rustic. For you. So different from what you were promised. But I suppose a roof is a roof, no matter how one comes by it. The insinuation was as thick and foul as mud. The woman flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but the rancher saw it. He turned his body, a slow, deliberate pivot, and placed himself between her and the other woman. He was not a tall man, but his presence was solid, immovable. He was a piece of the mountain, a slab of granite. He looked directly at the merchant's wife for the first time. His gray eyes were flat and cold. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet authority in his tone was more powerful than any shout. She is my wife, he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. Her name is my name. You will address her with respect, or you will not address her at all. He held her gaze until she looked away, her face mottling with fury and humiliation. A flicker of fear crossed her features before she gathered her outrage and swept out of the store, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The rancher turned back to the storekeeper. The salt, he repeated, his voice unchanged. He had not defended her honor. He had simply stated a fact and drawn a line. She is mine to protect. The message was clear. An attack on her was an attack on him. He had claimed her not just in name, but in deed. The ride home was heavy with unspoken things. The air in the wagon, which had once been a space of neutral distance, was now charged with the energy of their shared battle. The fragile peace had been broken, but in its place, something stronger was beginning to form. He had built a wall around her with his words, and she had taken shelter behind it. The silence in the cabin that night was different. It was no longer a void separating two strangers. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the alliance that had been forged in the crucible of public shame. He had offered her a roof, but in that moment in the store, he had offered her something far more valuable, a fortress. That night, the silence finally broke. They sat at the table long after the simple meal was finished, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The question had been building in her for weeks, a pressure behind her ribs. She had to understand. Why? She asked, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. Why did you do it? He did not pretend to misunderstand. He stared into the flames for a long time, his face a landscape of old sorrows. The silence stretched, but it was a thoughtful silence now, not an empty one. He was searching for words, a man unaccustomed to their use. This house, he began, his voice a low rumble, was built for 3 people. He paused, and she could hear the effort it took for him to continue. My wife, my daughter. There was a fever. It came through the valley one winter. Fast. There was nothing anyone could do. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on a memory that only he could see, a scene playing out in the heart of the fire. After they were gone, he continued. The silence, it was a living thing. A weight. Every creak of the floorboards was the sound of someone who wasn't there. Every gust of wind was a voice I couldn't hear. It was too loud. The silence was too loud. He picked up the small, carved bird from the mantelpiece, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. My daughter, she loved birds. I was carving this for her. I never finished it. He set the bird down gently, as if it were a fragile, sleeping thing. When I saw you in that church, I saw a different kind of silence about to swallow you whole. The silence of being an outcast, of having nothing and no one. I had too much nothing in this house. You had nothing left in the world, I thought. He trailed off, shrugging, unable to articulate the complex, impulsive logic of his grief. I thought maybe two kinds of silence together might make a better kind of quiet. The raw, unvarnished honesty of his confession cracked open the shell of her own guarded sorrow. He had not rescued her out of pity, but out of a shared understanding of loss. He had seen his own desolation mirrored in her. Tears she had refused to shed at the altar now tracked silently down her cheeks. She reached into a small cloth bundle she had kept with her, the only possession she had in the world. From it, she took a small object, a butterfly carved from a single piece of pale green jade, its wing broken. My mother gave this to me before I left my home, she said, her voice thick with unshed grief. She said it was for luck. She said America was a land of promise. She looked at the broken carving in her palm. My family, they are very poor. The man I was to marry, his father promised to pay my family's debts. He promised a good life for me, a future for my brothers. The contract was everything to them. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes holding his. It was not a marriage. It was a sale. And when a better offer came along, he tried to return the goods. The bitterness in her voice was sharp, but it was tempered by a profound sadness. He still holds the contract. My family is still in his debt. That is the threat he holds over me, that he could ruin them. In that moment, the transaction was complete. They had exchanged their stories, their vulnerabilities. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a strange, public contract. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had found a common shore in a sea of grief. The nature of his protection had to shift. He had offered her a roof against the weather and a name against the town's scorn. Now, he understood, he had to offer her a fortress against the past. The true danger was not the gossiping tongues of the town, but the legalistic cruelty of the man who still believed he owned her. The past arrived 3 weeks later, riding a fine black horse and dressed in a city suit that looked both expensive and out of place against the rugged landscape. The jilted groom did not come alone. He brought the town's lawman with him, a man whose loyalty was more to the town's power structure than to any abstract notion of justice. The rancher saw them coming from a long way off, two dark figures moving against the white snow. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the cold, still air. He did not stop. He continued his work, each swing of the axe a measured beat of defiance. The woman came to the door of the cabin, her face pale, a dishcloth clutched in her hand. The groom reined in his horse a few feet away, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. He looked from the rancher's worn work clothes to the woman's simple dress, and his smile widened. Well, isn't this a quaint domestic scene? He sneered. Playing house. The rancher sank the axe into the chopping block and turned to face him. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements slow and deliberate. State your business, he said, his voice flat. My business. The groom laughed, a short, ugly bark. He dismounted, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. My business is this contract. A legal, binding agreement with her father. It stipulates that in exchange for settling his considerable debts, his daughter's hand in marriage, and all that implies, is mine. You interfered with a business transaction. He looked past the rancher to the woman. The deal is off, of course. I have no use for soiled goods. But the debt remains. A debt I value at $5,000. The sum was astronomical, a fortune. It was an amount the rancher could not possibly have. The groom unfolded the document with a flourish. This contract gives me title to her family's property, their business, everything, should the debt not be paid. Or, he added, his eyes glittering with malice, should she fail to fulfill her end of the bargain, which she has. By marrying you. He handed the document to the lawman. It's all there, legal and binding. I want my money, or I am taking her as collateral. Her service will pay the debt. The lawman, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache, scanned the document. He avoided the rancher's eyes. It looks legal, he mumbled. It's got the signatures. The seal. You have 3 days, the groom said, his voice ringing with triumph. 3 days to produce $5,000. If not, the lawman and I will be back to collect my property. He swung himself back onto his horse, the picture of vindicated arrogance. He glanced at the woman one last time. You chose the wrong man. As they rode away, the rancher looked at the woman. The terror in her eyes was a raw, open wound. The fortress he had tried to build had been breached. The law itself was now the weapon aimed at them. That night, the cabin became a war room. The lantern burned late, casting a pool of desperate light on the rough-hewn table. The groom had, with foolish arrogance, left a copy of the contract with the lawman, who had grudgingly allowed the rancher to make a transcript. They pored over the dense, legalistic script, searching for a loophole, a crack in its ironclad cruelty. "It is my father's signature," she said, her voice barely a whisper, tracing the name with her finger. He would not have understood all these words. He only knew the promise of salvation for his family. The rancher stared at the paper, his jaw set. His world was one of tangible things: wood, iron, soil, weather. This world of paper and ink, of clauses and subclauses, was a foreign country. But he recognized the shape of a trap when he saw one. As he stared at the document, a name caught his eye: the Bridgeline Shipping Company, listed as the guarantor of the groom's father's business, the source of their wealth. The name was vaguely familiar, a ghost from another life. Before the ranch, before the grief, he had worked for a time on the railroad, laying track, moving goods. He had a memory for names and logistics, a skill he had thought long buried. "This company," he said, tapping the paper. "I think I know it." The woman looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "What is it?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. But an idea, a desperate, long-shot gamble, was forming in his mind. There was a man he had known from those days, a telegraph operator in the city, a man who had a reputation for being able to find out things. A man who owed him a favor from a long-forgotten poker game where the rancher had let him keep his winnings rather than see his family go hungry. The next morning, before dawn, he rode the 20 miles to the nearest town with a telegraph office, a journey made at a punishing pace. He sent a message, a string of cryptic questions about the Bridgeline Shipping Company, its finances, its principles. He signed it with a name he hadn't used in 10 years. It was a shot in the dark, a prayer sent down a humming wire. The operator told him a reply, if one came at all, would take at least a day, maybe more. He had less than 2. The final day dawned, cold and gray. Hope had dwindled to a tiny, guttering flame. There had been no reply to his telegraph. The rancher stood on the porch, watching the road, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He knew it was useless against a legal document, but it was a statement. He would not let her be taken without a fight. The woman stood beside him, her back straight, her face composed. They were a silent, united front. Just as the sun reached its zenith, they appeared on the horizon. The groom, the lawman, and this time, the groom's mother, who had come along to witness the final, public triumph. They rode with an air of grim ceremony. The groom dismounted, a smirk playing on his lips. "Time's up," he announced. "Do you have my money?" The rancher said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the road behind them. "I thought not," the groom said with a sigh of mock regret. He turned to the lawman. "Do your duty." The lawman shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving toward the woman. "Ma'am, you have to come with me." And then another sound reached them. The frantic, desperate pounding of a horse's hooves, riding hard. A lone rider, urging his mount on, kicking up a plume of snow and mud. It was the boy from the telegraph office. He slid his horse to a stop, his chest heaving, and held out a piece of yellow paper. "This just came," he gasped. "Marked urgent." The rancher took the telegraph, his eyes scanning the coded dots and dashes of the message. The lawman paused. The groom's face clouded with impatience and a flicker of unease. The rancher read the message, and a slow, grim satisfaction settled on his features. He looked up, not at the groom, but at the lawman. "This contract," he said, his voice ringing with a cold, hard clarity, "is based on fraud." "What nonsense is this?" the groom blustered. "The Bridgeline Shipping Company," the rancher continued, his eyes locked on the lawman, "went bankrupt 6 months ago. Its assets were seized. The company ceased to exist 2 months before this contract was ever signed." He held up the telegraph. "Furthermore, the company's principal owner, a man matching the groom's father's description, is wanted for fraud and embezzlement in 2 territories. This is a federal warrant." The groom's face went white. The color drained from his mother's triumphant expression, replaced by a mask of horror. The rancher took a step forward. "This entire arrangement, the debt, the contract, It was all a lie. A scheme to swindle desperate families. They have no money. They have no company. They have nothing but a list of crimes. He handed the telegraph to the lawman. The lawman read it, his eyes widening. He looked at the groom, no longer as a wealthy merchant's son, but as a common criminal. The power dynamic had shifted with the speed of an avalanche. "Looks like you had it handled," the lawman said to the rancher, a new respect in his tone. He turned to the groom, his hand now resting on his pistol. "You and your father are under arrest." The groom sputtered, his arrogance collapsing into panicked denial, but the lawman was already securing his wrists. His mother let out a strangled cry. Her public victory turned into the most profound public humiliation imaginable. The lawman tipped his hat to the rancher, a small gesture of acknowledgement from one honest man to another, and led his prisoners away. The spring that followed was a quiet revelation. The snow retreated, exposing the dark, fertile earth, and the world turned green again. The valley seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, shrugging off the weight of winter. The ranch, too, underwent a transformation. It was no longer a place of stark function, a bastion against grief. It was becoming a home. Small changes appeared, like the first wildflowers pushing through the soil. A window box appeared on the cabin, filled with hardy mountain herbs she had planted. The scent of them drifted into the cabin on the warm breeze, a fragrance of life and persistence. The inside of the cabin, once so spare, now held touches of her presence. A colorful woven blanket draped over a chair, a row of neatly organized jars on a shelf. The space was still quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet now, the easy silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. The rancher began to build an addition to the cabin, a new room on the side. The sounds of his hammer and saw became part of the daily rhythm of the homestead, a sound of expansion, of making more space, of a future being built one board at a time. He no longer moved with the restless energy of a man fleeing his own thoughts. His work was still steady and relentless, but it was now the work of a man building something, not just maintaining a holding pattern against sorrow. Sometimes, as he worked, she would bring him a cup of water, and he would stop and drink, and they would stand together for a moment in the warm sunlight, the silence between them full of shared purpose. The town, having witnessed the spectacular downfall of its most prominent family, had recalibrated its judgment. Respect had replaced suspicion. When they went for supplies now, they were greeted with nods and quiet hellos. They were no longer a scandal. They were a local legend. The story of the quiet rancher and his foreign wife who had faced down the town's biggest bullies was told and retold, growing with each telling. They had become part of the fabric of the place. The man himself was changing. The deep lines of grief etched around his eyes seemed to have softened. One afternoon, watching a newborn calf stumble after its mother, a slow smile touched his lips. It was a small thing, but she saw it, and it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm. The loud silence in his heart was finally being filled, not with noise, but with the soft sounds of a life being shared. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he was choosing to build. She, too, was transformed. The haunted, desperate look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. She was no longer a survivor, but a partner. She managed the ranch's accounts with a sharp mind that astounded him, turning his subsistence operation into a thriving enterprise. Her hands, once soft, were now capable, as skilled at tending a garden as they were at balancing a ledger. She had found her place, not as a possession or a charity case, but as an indispensable part of a whole. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they sat on the porch of their expanded home. The new room was finished, its window open to the cool evening air. He had fashioned a swing, and they sat on it, the gentle, rhythmic creak a soothing counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. He looked out over the land, his land, which now felt different, more complete. A home is not the land you own, he said, the thought coming to him as if it had been waiting there all along. It is the people you choose to protect on it. She looked at him, at his strong, weathered profile against the fading light, and she knew he was right. She had come to this place with nothing but a broken piece of jade and a stolen future. She had been given a name, a roof, a fortress. And here, in the quiet heart of the wilderness. With this quiet, honorable man, she had finally found what she had been promised all along. She had found a home,